The year was 1881, and out on the Dakota prairie, the land didn't give. It only took. It took the rain from the sky, leaving the sun to bake the earth into a cracked, dusty plate. It took the topsoil, letting the wind steal it away in brown clouds. And on 160 acres of this unforgiving ground, it was slowly taking everything from the Weston family. Arthur, Martha, and their daughter, Cora. Cora was 17, and for 6 of those years, a ghost had lived in her throat. A ghost that had stolen her voice. It happened the night their first home in Ohio burned down, the one with the green shutters and her mother's climbing roses. She'd let out a single tearing scream as the roof caved in, and she hadn't spoken a word since. Her silence was a weight. For her father, Arthur, it was another failure in a long list of them. For her mother, Martha, it was a constant, nagging sorrow. For Cora, it was just life. Her world was a quiet one, made of chores and the ache in her back. She milked the bony cow before dawn. She fed the chickens that barely laid. She worked the stunted cornfield beside her father, a man who rarely met her gaze. He was always looking at the horizon, waiting for a rescue that never came. Their land shared a border with the Lakota, an invisible line of caution and history that neither side ever crossed. Arthur had warned her. "We're on their land, even if the government says it's ours," he'd said. "We don't want trouble." They were too tired for trouble, but trouble doesn't always ask for an invitation. One sweltering August afternoon, Cora went to the creek that marked the boundary. The vegetable patch was dying, and she carried 2 heavy wooden buckets to bring it life. The creek was low, a thin silver ribbon. As she knelt to dip a bucket, she heard a sound that didn't belong. A baby's cry. Her heart hammered in her chest. She froze, hidden by the tall reeds. On the other side of the creek, under a lone cottonwood tree, was a small group of Lakota. Their chief, a man with a somber face named Chayton, sat beside a young woman named Winona. Winona was cradling a swaddled infant, rocking him gently. It was a peaceful scene, for a moment. Then, with a deafening crack, a heavy, rotted branch broke from the cottonwood. It crashed to the ground, striking a dead log. The impact woke something angry from its slumber. A low hum grew into a roar. A dark, boiling cloud erupted from the log. A swarm of wild bees. The air turned into a chaotic, stinging fury. The bees swirled, enraged, their anger looking for a target. Winona cried out, curling her body around her child. Chayton leaped up, grabbing for a blanket, but the swarm was too fast. It was a living weapon, and it was moving toward the heat, toward the sound. It was moving toward the crying baby. In that instant, Cora didn't think. 6 years of silence, of feeling like a useless shadow, it all fell away. She saw only the child, so small and helpless. She saw the terror on the mother's face. She dropped her bucket, grabbed a handful of wild berries, and crushed them in her palms. Then she stood up. She burst from the reeds, a pale ghost against the brown prairie. She waved her arms, smearing the sweet, sticky berry juice on her face, her neck. And from the back of her throat, she made a sound. The first sound in 6 years. It wasn't a word. It was a raw, guttural roar. A cry of pure, desperate will. And it was enough. The sound, the scent, the sudden movement, it drew the swarm's attention. A few bees broke off, then a dozen, then the entire cloud veered away from the mother and child. They veered toward Cora. Chayton froze. The blanket in his hands, his eyes locked on the settler girl. He saw the wild purpose in her eyes. He understood what she was doing. She was offering herself as a sacrifice. Cora turned and ran. Not toward home. Away. Out into the open prairie. The hum followed her, a terrible, roaring halo. The first sting was a hot needle in her cheek, another on her neck, her eyelid. The pain was electric, but she ran on, leading them away. She could feel them crawling in her hair, on her skin. Her vision blurred. The world became a storm of pain and motion, the swarm a living cloak of vengeance. She ran until her lungs burned and her legs gave out. She tripped, fell hard into the dust, and the world went dark. From the creek, Chaiton and his people watched in stunned disbelief. They saw the girl run, drawing death away from his son, taking it into herself. A debt had just been created. A debt so profound honor would demand it be repaid. Cora woke to a gentle hand on her shoulder. She flinched. She tried to move, but her body wouldn't obey. Chaiton knelt beside her. Her face was a grotesque mask, swollen and red, barely recognizable. He saw the track of a single tear through the dust on her cheek. He lifted her as if she weighed nothing. He began the long walk back, carrying the silent girl who had screamed for his son with her actions. When Arthur Weston saw the Lakota chief walking toward his cabin, carrying his daughter's limp body, his blood ran cold. He grabbed his rifle. "What have you done?" he demanded, his voice trembling. "She is not harmed by us," Chaiton said, his English slow and deliberate. "She saved my son. The bees." Arthur's anger collapsed into horror as he saw his daughter's face. He took her from Chaiton's arms, staggering under her small weight. A sound of pure anguish escaped his lips. He carried her inside, laying her on her cot. Martha was already weeping, rushing to get a cool cloth. Through the doorway, Chaiton watched the family's grief. Then, without a word, he and his people vanished back across the creek. Cora drifted in a fever for 2 days. In her moments of consciousness, she heard her parents despair. "The plowshares cracked clean through," her father said, his voice heavy with defeat. "It's over. This place has beaten us." Cora closed her eyes. Her one great act of courage, and for what? Her family was still crumbling. She was still a burden. On the morning of the 3rd day, she was strong enough to sit by the open door. She saw her father staring at the broken plowshare in the yard, his face a mask of desolation. That's when she saw the dust cloud on the horizon. It was coming from the Lakota lands, and it was big. Arthur saw it too, his hand going to his side for the rifle he didn't have. Martha rushed to the door, wrapping an arm around Cora's shoulders. "Arthur," she whispered. Fear was the first thought. Retribution. A misunderstanding. The dust cloud resolved into dozens of figures, on horseback and on foot. It was the entire village. They moved with a quiet purpose, flowing across the creek as if the invisible line had never been there. Chaiton was at their head. But the men with him weren't carrying weapons. They were carrying tools, axes, hoes, ropes. The women carried baskets of food and blankets. They came right into the yard, their sheer numbers overwhelming the small, struggling farm. This wasn't an attack. It was something else entirely. Chaiton dismounted and walked to Arthur. He didn't offer a greeting. He just pointed to the broken plowshare. "This is iron?" he asked. Arthur, stunned, could only nod. Chaiton spoke to his men. 2 of them came forward. They examined the break, and then one returned with a heavy forge tool. They began to work. The rest of the tribe moved into action, like a well-oiled machine. A team of men hitched their own draft horses to a heavy plow and began turning the hard, dry soil of the north field. Others went to the sagging fence line and began resetting posts, the ring of their axes filling the air. The women flowed into Martha's wilting garden, pulling weeds, turning the soil, and watering the thirsty plants from large skins they had brought. They sang softly as they worked, a low, rhythmic chant. Winona, Chaiton's wife, walked onto the porch, her son in her arms. She knelt before Cora. "For the brave one," she said softly, and began to gently apply a cool, fragrant salve to Cora's stings. The relief was immediate. The baby in her arms reached out a tiny hand and brushed it against Cora's arm. Cora began to weep, not from pain, but from a gratitude so overwhelming it was an ache in her chest. All day they worked. Arthur Weston stood in his yard, watching in stunned humility. His pride, the heaviest burden of all, crumbled to dust. Eventually, he picked up a hammer and began to work alongside them, becoming a small part of the larger rhythm. As the sun set, the work was done. The north field was plowed, the fence was strong, the garden was tended, and the broken plowshare was mended, stronger than before. Chayton approached Arthur again. He placed a hand on the mended plow. "A farm needs strong iron," he said. Then he looked toward the cabin, his gaze finding Cora. "And a family needs a strong heart." He walked over to Cora and placed a hand gently on her shoulder. He looked at the girl who had no voice and saw the spirit that had spoken louder than any warrior's cry. Then, he and his people left as quietly as they had come. In the quiet that followed, Arthur walked over to his wife and daughter. He looked at Cora. For the first time in a long time, he truly saw her. Not the mute girl, not the burden. He saw the hero who had saved them all. He reached out and touched her cheek. "My daughter," he said, his voice thick with emotion. And in that moment, Cora knew she was no longer a ghost in her own life. Life on the farm found a new rhythm, a rhythm of hope. The corn in the north field grew tall and green. The boundary with the Lakota became a bridge, not a wall. Gifts were exchanged without words. A brace of rabbits left on the porch, a basket of hearty vegetables from Martha's now thriving garden. A friendship bloomed between Cora and Winona, built in the comfortable silence of shelling beans on the porch steps. Cora's scars faded to faint silvery lines, medals of courage. She still did not speak, but it no longer mattered. She had found her place. But the prairie holds its secrets close, and the peace they had found was more fragile than they knew. The bee swarm hadn't been an accident. One evening, Chayton came to their cabin alone. He sat with Arthur on the porch, a rare seriousness on his face. He spoke of the branch that had fallen, the log that had shattered. "It was not the wind," he said, his English slow and careful. "The branch was cut, almost through, set to fall. Someone wanted the bees angry." Arthur's blood ran cold. "Who? One of your people?" Chayton shook his head. "No, the tracks were from a shod horse, a white man's horse." He looked out over the darkening prairie. "Someone wanted my son dead. Or they wanted you to think we did. To start a war." The implication was terrifying. They had an enemy they couldn't see, a snake hiding in the grass. The peace they had built was a lie, a temporary ceasefire in a war they didn't even know they were fighting. The fear returned, colder this time because it had a human shape. Arthur started carrying his rifle again. Cora found herself watching the horizon, not for rain clouds, but for riders. Every shadow held a potential threat. Who would do such a thing? Who wanted to see them destroyed? The answer, when it came, was more shocking than they could have imagined. It came in the form of a land surveyor from the railroad, a man with a fancy suit and cold eyes. He rode up one morning with a deed in his hand. "This land has been purchased by the Dakota Rail Company," he announced, not even dismounting. "You're trespassing. You have 30 days to vacate." Arthur was stunned. "Purchased? This is my homestead. I have a claim." The surveyor just smiled, a thin, cruel smile. "Your claim, Mr. Weston, has been deemed invalid. A clerical error." He pointed to a figure on the ridge behind him, a man on a horse, watching them. "Your neighbor has already sold his claim." He was smart. Cora looked up at the figure on the ridge. The sun was in her eyes, but she could see the man's shape, the way he sat his horse, and a cold dread washed over her. She knew that shape. He was their only other neighbor, a man named Silas Kane, a quiet, bitter man who had lost his own family to sickness years ago. He had always kept his distance, but now, it seemed, he had been much closer than they thought. The surveyor turned to ride away. 30 days, Weston, or we'll have the sheriff remove you." As he left, Cora's eyes were still fixed on Silas Kane. He raised a hand, not in a wave, but in a gesture of ownership, of triumph. And in that moment, she knew. The cut branch, the spooked horse, the angry bees. It was him. It had all been him. The fight for their land became a frantic, hopeless race against time. Arthur rode to the county seat, his own deed clutched in his hand, but no one would listen. The railroad had money, influence. A clerical error was a closed door he couldn't force open. They were being erased. Silas Kane's presence became a constant, silent threat. He would ride the perimeter of their land, just watching. His message was clear. This is mine now. The Westons were trapped. They had nowhere to go, no money, and the prairie was an unforgiving place for a family with nothing. Desperation began to set in. Martha grew thin and pale, her constant murmuring turning into frantic, whispered prayers. Arthur's brief flicker of hope was extinguished, replaced by a hollow-eyed despair. Cora watched them, her heart aching. She had saved a life, but she couldn't save her family. Her great sacrifice felt small and useless against the cold mechanics of greed. One night, she couldn't sleep. The silence in the cabin was suffocating. She slipped outside into the cool, moonlit air. She needed to think. She walked toward the creek, her feet silent on the dusty path. As she neared the cottonwood tree, she heard voices, low and angry. She dropped to the ground, crawling forward until she could see through the reeds. It was Silas Kane, and he wasn't alone. He was talking to the railroad surveyor. "It's not enough," Silas was saying, his voice a low growl. "Forcing them out isn't enough. I want them gone. Wiped off this land like they were never here." "The company just wants the land, Silas," the surveyor said, his voice impatient. "What you do after is your business. But the chief, he's been asking questions. He knows the bee swarm wasn't natural. If he connects it to you—" "Let him," Silas sneered. "What's he going to do? He has no proof." The surveyor looked nervous. "Just be careful. The deal is done. Don't ruin it." He mounted his horse and rode away, leaving Silas alone in the moonlight. Silas stood for a long moment, staring at the Weston cabin. Cora could see his face clearly. It was twisted with a hatred so profound it was terrifying. This wasn't just about land. This was personal. But why? They had barely ever spoken to him. He then turned his gaze in her direction, as if he could feel her watching. Cora's heart stopped. He couldn't see her, could he? He started walking, not toward his own homestead, but along the creek bed, toward the Lakota lands. Cora's curiosity overcame her fear. She followed, keeping to the shadows. He moved with a strange purpose, stopping at a small, secluded clearing. In the center of the clearing was a small mound of stones, a grave marker. Silas knelt before it. He reached into his coat and pulled out a small, faded photograph. A woman and 2 small children, his family. "Soon, my love," he whispered, his voice thick with a grief that sounded like madness. "Soon they'll pay for what they did. They'll know the pain I felt." Cora didn't understand. What did the Westons have to do with the death of his family? It made no sense. Then Silas did something that made her blood turn to ice. He pulled a small carved wooden bird from his pocket and placed it on the grave. Cora recognized it instantly. Her father had carved dozens of them. It was his signature work, a hobby from their life back in Ohio. She had one just like it on the shelf above her cot, and then she remembered. A fever. Sickness sweeping through their small settlement in Ohio. The Kanes, their neighbors, had lost everyone. Arthur, desperate to help, had brought them food, medicine. It hadn't been enough. It wasn't a feud. It was a misunderstanding, a grief that had festered into a terrible, misplaced vengeance. Silas didn't just want their land. He blamed her father for the death of his family. He believed Arthur had brought the sickness to his door, and he had followed them 1,000 miles to exact his revenge. The final night came with the chilling howl of the wind. They had only 1 day left. Arthur sat at the table, his head in his hands, a broken man. Martha was packing their few belongings into a crate, her movements slow and defeated. The silence in the cabin was the silence of a tomb. Cora knew Silas wouldn't let them just leave. His whispered promise at the grave echoed in her mind. He wanted them gone, forever. Suddenly, the night was shattered by the smell of smoke. Cora was the first to notice it, a sharp, acrid scent that was terrifyingly familiar. She ran to the door and threw it open. The barn was on fire. Flames were already licking up the dry wooden walls, a roaring monster against the black sky. It was happening again, just like in Ohio. "Arthur!" Martha screamed. Arthur looked up, his eyes wide with a dawning horror. It wasn't just about the land. It was about the fire. Silas Kane was trying to recreate the night that had stolen Cora's voice. He was trying to finish the job, but he hadn't counted on one thing: the Lakota. Chayton and 2 of his warriors had seen the glow from their camp. They came riding hard, appearing out of the darkness like vengeful spirits. They weren't there to save the barn. They were there to settle a debt. Chayton had found proof on the creek bed, a discarded glove with the initials S.C. He knew who had cut the branch. The confrontation was brutal and swift. Silas was caught between the burning barn and the silent, determined warriors. He pulled a pistol, his face a mask of cornered rage. "This is between me and him," he screamed, pointing at Arthur, who had run out onto the porch. "He killed my family." "The sickness killed them, Silas," Arthur yelled back, the truth finally shouted into the night. "I was trying to help." But Silas was beyond reason. He raised the pistol, not at Chayton, but at Arthur. From the doorway, Cora saw it happen. The flash of the hammer, the intent in Silas's eyes, the memory of the first fire, the terror, the loss, it all came rushing back. The ghost in her throat, the one that had held her silent for 6 long years, was finally faced with a terror that was stronger. A single word tore from her lips, a sound rusty and broken, but clear as a bell in the fiery night. "No!" The sound shocked everyone into stillness. Silas faltered for a fraction of a second, his aim wavering. It was all Chayton needed. He threw his hatchet, a spinning arc of dark metal. It struck Silas's wrist, not to kill, but to disarm. The pistol clattered to the ground. The fight was over. As Chayton's warriors subdued the writhing, cursing Silas, Cora stood in the doorway, her hand over her mouth, the feel of that single, impossible word still vibrating on her lips. Her mother and father stared at her, their faces a mixture of shock and disbelief. Martha took a hesitant step forward. "Cora?" she whispered. Cora looked at her mother, at the tears of hope welling in her eyes. She took a deep breath, the air tasting of smoke and freedom. "Mama," she said. The word was quiet, but it was the loudest sound the prairie had ever heard. The fire consumed the barn, but it didn't take their hope. Silas Kane was handed over to the sheriff, his crimes finally brought to light. The railroad, faced with a brewing scandal and the unified opposition of the settlers and the Lakota, quietly reinstated Arthur Weston's claim. The land was theirs, but it was more than that now. It was a shared space, a place where 2 different worlds had learned to meet. Cora's voice, once unlocked, came back slowly, shyly at first, then with growing confidence. She talked to her mother for hours, the words tumbling out, 6 years of silence pouring into the light. She taught the Lakota children English words, and they taught her their games. The invisible line at the creek was gone, washed away by a current of shared respect and a debt paid in honor. Arthur Weston was no longer a man stooped by failure. He stood tall, a man who had found his courage in the courage of his daughter. The silence was gone from their home, replaced by laughter, by conversation, by the happy gurgle of Winona's baby, who Cora often held on the porch. One evening, as the sun set, Cora stood with her father, looking out over the now green fields. "I was so afraid," she said softly. "All those years, I thought if I spoke, the fire would come back." Arthur put his arm around her. "The fire came back anyway," he said, his voice full of a new wisdom. "But this time, you had a voice to fight it." She had learned that a voice isn't just for speaking. It's for standing up, for fighting back, for roaring in the face of injustice. And sometimes, a single word, spoken at the right moment, can be powerful enough to save the world. If you enjoyed this story about finding your voice and the unexpected bonds of community, a story that reminds us that courage speaks a language all its own, don't forget to like and subscribe. Because sometimes, the deepest silence holds the most powerful scream.